Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Sarah. As always, I am happy to be with you on a week that has somehow managed to go both really fast and really slow. I was actually surprised it was Friday. I thought it was earlier in the week, but then, I don't know, the week also went by really fast in terms of trying to get stuff done. So, I don't know, I'm in some sort of a time vortex. Maybe because we haven't switched to daylight savings time yet. Did I mention that in the last episode? I can't remember. So if I'm repeating myself, I apologize. But the states, of course, went to daylight savings time last weekend. We don't go to daylight savings time until the 26th. And that's not really that big of a deal, except that puts... I know that we are 5 hours ahead of the East Coast and 8 hours ahead of the West Coast, except now we are 4 hours ahead of the East Coast and 7 hours ahead of the West Coast for 2 weeks. And I am continuously confused as to what time it actually is in the states that I am trying to figure out. In fact, Mary and I talked about that a little bit. I was so worried. I kept double checking the math on the time of her interview because her interview was on Sunday this past weekend. And of course, that's when the time change happened. And so I was panicked that I'd sent her the wrong time information. But it all worked out, and we had the interview. And Mary, being Mary T. Ford, the author of this week's interview, we are talking about, it's not a memoir. If her husband had written it, it would be a memoir, but it is written by Mary about experiences in her husband's life when he was a teenager. And so it's a novel. It's a fictionalized version of those events, although based on his memories and just all of those times. So it's not exactly a memoir, but it reads very much like one, and it is called Boy at the Crossroads, From Teenage Runaway to Class President. Let me go ahead and give you the description of this book. Tennessee, 1955. Conley Ford learned quickly the world's full of hard knocks. Seeking the wrong kind of excitement, the restless 13-year-old falls in with a group of older boys joyriding in stolen Mercury cars, until he is arrested and put on probation. With a harsh father waiting and too embarrassed to face his classmates as a jailbird, the impetuous youth leaves town, making it all the way to New Orleans. No stranger to demanding work from the age he was old enough to walk, Conley uses his wits and street smarts to commandeer a hot dog cart and make some cash. But when a turf war and a near-fatal accident sends him back home, the resourceful teen faces a choice between staying in misery or once again striking out into a dangerous world. Can this troubled young man ever find somewhere he can thrive? Inspired by real events and told through cleverly crafted storytelling, Mary Ford depicts an adolescent who grew up impoverished and with minimal affection, but still found the strength to follow his gut towards something more. And as his journey takes him to Cincinnati, Chicago, and other far-flung parts of the United States, a lost little traveler ends up finding acceptance and hope in the one place he never expected. And so that is the description. Again, it is called Boy at the Crossroads, From Teenage Runaway to Class President. So you know that he does manage to be elected at some point class president, but things have changed so much since this was written, or since the events of this book took place, 1955. Conley was born in 1942. He was born the same year as my dad, so a lot of these stories reminded me just not of my dad's life necessarily, but of my dad's generation. And so that was fun to read, but also just, hitchhiking was a lot more common in days gone by, we didn't, of course, have cell phones, so you could run away at 13 and hitchhike from Tennessee to New Orleans. Well, first to Florida, and then he ended up in New Orleans. With 50 cents in his pocket. That's what he had, and he managed to do all of these amazing things at 13, where most of us probably listening to that sentence are thinking, oh my goodness, I can't imagine my 13-year-old running off, not being able to contact him. Again, no cell phones. My youngest niece will be 13 in August. I have a nephew who just turned 13 a few weeks ago. Now I'm thinking about that 13-year-old. Whew, yeah, it's crazy, but it's a really fun read, and it is very interesting to learn about, a person my dad's age, a boy my dad's age, but who lived in a very different world from my dad. My dad growing up in rural Montana and rural Oregon, this kid growing up in rural Tennessee. Some similarities, but some differences as well, and very different family sizes. Dad is the youngest of 4. Conley is the second youngest of 16. So imagine that. But just a lot of really, really interesting stories. He sounds like a very interesting man from just the glimpse you get here in this book. But let's go ahead and turn to the interview with Mary so she can tell more about the writing of this story and this book. Hi, Mary. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm happy to have you here as well. I'm excited to talk about your novel or your book, Boy at the Crossroads. Before we do that, though, if you wouldn't mind sharing just a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit, that would be great.
Well, sure. And I'm not ashamed to say I'm 74 years old. So I published my first novel at 72. And my message to your listeners is, if I can do it, they can do it too. Everybody's got a story inside of them. So I was a long-term journalist. I was editor of 2 local papers here in Massachusetts for almost 30 years, and I was a reporter before that. But in a previous life, I actually majored in education and was a teacher. So I walked into my first newsroom at 35, and I knew I fit immediately. And the reason for that is that they are the messiest places on earth. And I'm a little bit of a disheveled mess often, especially in an office environment. So I felt very comfortable that I didn't have to have super clean desks and floors and things like that. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here and share my journey. It was a journey from being a journalist to a novelist or to authorship, which was a little more complex and a little more challenging than I expected.
I love 2 things about what you said. One, I also would be much happier with being surrounded by people who are not completely neat freaks.
Right.
And then 2, I love that, you went from teaching, and then at 35, you went in a different direction. You started a different career. And then at 72, you did another kind of pivot that, that's great.
Yeah, I'm getting pretty good, I guess, at reinventing myself, which is a surprise.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
The book is called Boy at the Crossroads, and I didn't give the subtitle earlier, which is From Teenage Runaway to Class President. Can you give an overview of the story?
Sure. It's my husband's story. So my husband is from East Tennessee, and he's young. He is the 15th of 16 children. So we met in California years and years ago when I went out there for a teaching job, and we lived in the same apartment complex. We started dating, and obviously we fell in love and got married. And I heard this story about how he ran away at 13 and hitchhiked all over the South. And on one of his excursions or adventures, he ended up in New Orleans selling hot dogs, came home again, took off again, came home, took off again, different parts of the country. And so when he came back and finally settled down, he had to miss a year. He missed a year of school. So there was a lot. He had to stay back and blah, blah, blah. And the whole reason for him running away initially was that he was with some other bad teenagers they didn't call it stealing cars. They were joyriding, and they were they had to be Mercuries because it was a magical way you could start them without a key. So anyway, he got arrested and he went through the whole court process. So when he was heading to school, he said, I can't go back to school because they'll call me a jailbird and I'll be picked on and it'll be awful. So when he finally did go back, rather than being called a jailbird, they were in awe because in Halls Crossroads, Tennessee, it's very small and no one had been anywhere. So they made him class president. So it was such a funny story. I thought someday I'm going to have to write this. So it took a long time, but I finally did. So he was my inspiration.
Absolutely. I mean, and 13, and he runs away and he leaves and he's got like 45 cents in his pocket or something. I can't even remember the exact number.
It was 50 cents. Yeah.
Yeah. Crazy. I'm not sure what that would translate to with inflation, but it's not a lot.
For a cup of coffee, I think, and some candy bars, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I can definitely see the being in a relationship with someone who has that story in their background. You'd want to know more. You'd want to kind of share that story. I definitely understand. That was your inspiration. What then gave you the final push to say, I'm going to write this and see if we can publish it?
Well, what happened was when I got into journalism, we were actually living in Illinois and we were transferred here to Massachusetts with his job. And I got a job at the local paper right away. And I was a reporter for 4 years before I was promoted to editor. And that was incredibly time consuming, 40 to 60 hours a week. I loved every minute of it. I mean, I mentored dozens of young reporters over the years, so I was totally all in. But when my husband would go on his visits to East Tennessee, because of my job, I didn't always go with him. I would give him a tape recorder, and it was the old-fashioned kind with little tiny tapes. And I just told him to talk into the tapes and just put down any detail about his youth that he could remember. He had an amazing memory. So when I retired back in the end of 2018, suddenly I went from this 40 to 60 hour a week, big fish in a little pond, totally committed editor of 2 newspapers to what am I going to do now? I need a project. So I started transcribing the tapes, and that was pure drudgery, but I made it through, and none of them were in order. It was bits and pieces all over the place, but great fodder for a story. And then I took a bunch of classes and I joined meetups, which if your audience doesn't know, they're free and they have meetups for everything. You just go online and if you like stamp collecting, you can be in a stamp collecting meetup. But I joined these writing meetups and where I learned, and some of the leaders of these meetups were very talented, that I needed to change my style of writing from being a reporter to showing rather than telling. So journalism is informational. So you want to walk away when you read a story and know what happened, know why your taxes are going up, be very clear. There isn't necessarily a lot of fluff. And so when you actually start to be an author, you have to enhance and you have to show more. You have to show emotions and things like that. So that was a bit of a challenge, but it clicked. And I was so glad. And it took a while, but and initially I thought I was writing a memoir. And in one of my classes, there's a center in Boston called Grub Street. And it's named after a street in England or in London, which used to have a lot of writers. But you can take online or in-person classes. And that's where I learned that I was actually writing a novel, not a memoir, because it wasn't about me. And so with the knowledge that I was writing a novel inspired by a true story, it gave me a little more freedom. I didn't feel like I had to be totally anchored to thinking what exactly happened that day and what did people say, because nobody can remember all of those fine details. So I dove into the project, and because I'm project oriented and I was used to turning something out week in and week out, I finished. A lot of people don't tend to do that, I found, but and then because of our ages, and I decided after researching, even taking a class on how to get an agent and how to go through all this, and I have several friends that have been traditionally published, it takes a long time. And then sometimes when your book gets picked up, it's still a year or two before it gets published and blah, blah, blah. So I thought, nope, I'm going to go the self-publishing route. But I used a company that assists you with self-publishing. So the world of self-publishing is massive and huge. And there's all kinds of companies and people out there. So you have to be really careful, I think, when you dive in, because it can get expensive. But that's what I did. And then I had a great experience. So I've been having a lot of fun doing talks and being on podcasts. I've been on local cable TV, and my books in all the local libraries. I've been to the high schools. So it's been a wonderful experience, and it helped me put my journalism career in the rearview mirror.
Now that you know a little bit more about the story and how it came about, we're going to take our first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about writing what is not quite a memoir, more of a novel, but still based on true events. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with Mary T. Ford as we discuss her novel, Boy at the Crossroads, From Teenage Runaway to Class President. Let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
I'm glad that you mentioned, memoir versus a novel. And when you were writing, obviously, people aren't going to remember exact conversations, so you can kind of create those as you go. But did you stick as much as possible to your husband's memories of those events, or did you kind of fill in the gaps in other ways?
I've stuck mostly to it. Again, he had an incredible memory for all these details, but I had to. And the nice thing about it, especially for a first-time novel, is that it had kind of a trajectory. It had a flow. It had a story that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I didn't have to invent characters or invent the story. It was all laid out for me. But one of the biggest challenges was, and he was with me 100% of the way, I would talk to him. I went over the chronology over and over again. The hardest thing, and this may be a guy thing, and some people may disagree, but it was hard for me to get him to talk about how he felt. I would say, well, how did you feel because you didn't shower in 5 days? Well, boys don't care about that. I said, well, they might. Were you scared? It was hard, but I pulled it out of him. So I had to enhance some of the emotion a little bit, but the story itself is 100% what he did and where he went, and the relationships with his humongous family is all there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Some of the conversations I changed just a couple of names where I thought, if like one of the guys that was sort of the ringleader in the Mercury gang where they were stealing Mercuries, I thought maybe he's still alive and his grandchildren don't know about it. So I changed his name, and a couple of other names where I thought if the person might still be around, they might be embarrassed.
Right. Yeah. Good thought. My father was born the same year as your husband, so I completely understand some of the asking questions of, well, what did you think of that? Or how did you feel about that? And my dad would just say things like, oh, I don't know. I never really thought about it. Yeah. I think it might be a generational thing as well as, I don't know if men tend more toward that than women, but I think it might be a generational thing for sure.
Yeah, it could be. Yes, absolutely. Because people, the way of life was very different. Now, he was from a poor family in East Tennessee and Appalachia region, but they didn't know they were poor. but they believed in hard work. And everyone worked. In fact, he would, my husband loved working in the yard and doing all these things that my sons don't like. I grew up in a completely different generation. So, it was just a different world. And so I don't think they talked as much about emotion. They just got on with it.
Mm-hmm. Even when he comes home from, he's gone for several months when he runs away the first time and comes home and he said, I think there's some comment like, Mom had tears in her eyes, so I know she missed me, or, just something along those lines. And most parents would be thinking, your kid was gone for months. Why are you not more upset?
And no one hugged, no one kissed.
Yep.
It's funny. One of my, this wonderful guy named Ricky, who runs one of my meetups called Dorchester Novel Writers, so he helped, critique. He would take a chapter, and he was always funny. So in that little quip, he went, that didn't start until Dr. Spock. Before Dr. Spock, who wrote, in case your readers don't know, he wrote this book about how to raise babies when they were young. And I had one, it was like my Bible. But suddenly everyone began cuddling and crying and, and making sure their kids were always happy, and everyone got a trophy. And it was very different before Dr. Spock.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's just amazing because this wasn't the only time that he ran away. He did it a couple more times. And
right?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Well, his dad finally gave him a ticket.
Yes.
I don't want you on the road anymore. Just take the train. So he took advantage of that.
And in some ways, you can tell that he's definitely the youngest in a large family, because I'm the youngest of only 3, and the parenting was different by the time I came along. So when you're number 15, probably your parents are like, whatever, we're tired.
Yeah. It's funny too, because I have a sister who's 15 years younger than me. So there were 4 of us. And then Holly was like the bonus child. And she grew up in a different family. I used to come home and say, who are these parents? They weren't mine.
Yeah, exactly.
It was completely different. So her memories and her, when we talk about our childhood, I thought, okay, Holly did not have those experiences that we had.
Yeah. When it comes to writing about family, in this case, some people that you have met, how do you go about character development? Because you are writing a novel. So was character development, do you feel different than if you had just been writing a straightforward novel?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, this was my first attempt, and I'm working on another novel, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So it's very different. But of course, the people, for the most part, were real, and so the actual interactions with his family and that dynamic is always there, but in some ways is a smaller part of the book, because it was a lot about the people he met along the route and who helped him and how we learned things, and his the guys in the Mercury gang. And so it wasn't as difficult. And of course, most of his brothers and sisters have passed away. So there's just one sister and one brother who are still around. And so I didn't worry too much. And they were very positive about it for the most part. I was a little nervous. I didn't want to paint things in just a terrible way that people would, be embarrassed or hate the book or whatever. So overall, the family, especially the nieces and nephews who didn't really know their grandparents, have been very positive about it. And the book is now at Halls High School, and they talked about it at one of the reunions recently. And so overall, I'm pretty happy that no one is, at least at this point, I haven't been threatened with any great lawsuits or anything like that. But I was cognizant of it. And I think the key is too that you want to make sure that the people that you paint, whether it is straight fiction or you're writing about people that actually were alive, is that you make them full, complicated people, that they're not just kind of flat, one-dimensional, like just mean, just hardworking. I mean, everyone has multiple facets. And I hope with Conley's dad, that comes through, that he was a complicated man who had 16 children. came up through the Depression in very difficult times that, helped form who he was. And like we were saying, it wasn't a time when you just cuddled your kids and tried to make the world safe and easy for them. You were more worried about feeding them and putting clothes on them and helping them help you support the family.
Obviously, you're writing about your husband, someone you know very well, although during a time period when you didn't know him. But what do you hope about him as this 13 to, it's mainly when he's younger, but it does extend a little bit into his teens and beyond, or his 20s and beyond. But what do you hope will resonate about him as a character for readers?
Well, I hope that what comes through, and from many of the reviews, which have been very inspiring, just, from total strangers on Amazon or in some of the other platforms, is that if you've made some bad decisions in life, you can still make it through and be a successful person. And if you didn't have all the things going for you, like he graduated from college at 52, and it was always his dream to go, you can still do it. It can be inspirational. And the other thing that I think, and one of the reviewers mentioned that she or he was very interested in, that every decision that he made it himself. Where today, I think young people, and I'm a mom, my sons are both in their 40s now, but they have trouble, I think, young people, not necessarily people in their 40s, but everyone has to have kind of a group think about something, where he went ahead and just made these decisions right from the get-go, running away and how he was going to survive and getting the job in New Orleans and heading back home. And then, just going on joining the Air Force, which he always his whole life said that was the best decision he ever made, because it just opened up so many doors of opportunity.
And how old was he when he bought a car? Like 15?
Yeah, well, it was an old car, and I think it was probably 16, and they fixed it up. It was the old jalopy days.
Oh no, I meant the one that he bought in Chicago when he just went and bought a car.
That one, yeah, 14. He went out, he bought that car and then got arrested, got stopped next block. He didn't get that.
Yeah. I mean, how many 14-year-olds are even going to think, I'm in a town I've never been in before, I'm going to buy a car.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that was amazing. So obviously he had a very interesting life that you heard about and wanted to write about. What was his reaction when you said, you know what, I think I want to write this for publication?
He loved it. He has always loved being the center of attention. He has an amazing personality, loves to laugh, tell stories. I mean, he gets that from his background. And so he loved it. He thought there were 2 or 3 more books in there. And the thing that disappointed him is that, and I know from being an editor, that so much ends up on the cutting room floor. And I learned from one of my Grub Street instructors that if it doesn't move the story forward, the worst thing you can do in a memoir-like novel, like I have, is to put too much in there, to put too many vignettes, too many trips down memory lane. Everyone has those. And if it doesn't move the story forward, cut it out. So he was quite upset about some of the stuff that didn't make it in.
Sure, yeah. And then he has a note at the back kind of talking about some of the things that you mentioned earlier about, it's not too late. You can still do things that you set your mind to, et cetera. Yeah. Did you ask him to write that? Did he offer to write that?
Yeah, no, we worked together on that. I mean, I edited it for him, but those were his own words and his own thoughts that he wanted to share, because, it was kind of an emotional thing for him. And sometimes when some nephews would call that he hadn't talked to in years, and he just burst into tears talking to them. So I think overall, and happy tears, he was, it was something he wanted to share. And I think the book needed that to sort of, because some people have said, well, I want to find out what kind of husband and father he was. I want to find out this or that. And so it needed a little bit of a finish.
And how about your sons? Did they know these stories, or did they start learning it as you were listening to the tapes, or had your husband told them?
They knew a lot of the stories. I can't say they got tired of them. Some of them. I don't think they knew too much about the criminal aspect. I don't think, Conley wasn't particularly proud of that, but they were both very happy with the final result and have shared it with their friends and helped me market it. And so it's been a good thing overall. I'm just so happy that I was able to do it. And I feel so strongly that people can do this. And as an editor who mentored reporters over many, many years, I learned that writing is a craft, not an art. I mean, that doesn't mean that there aren't fabulously beautiful writers out there like Shakespeare, and none of us are going to become that. But the vast majority, if you study the craft and you practice it and you listen and you learn, you can write. And the main thrust of anything, and I've learned this from journalism, isn't how good a writer you are, it's how good the story is. So if a story is good, people are going to read it, whether it's beautifully written or not. So I just run into so many people that will say, I can't write. I'm not a writer. I said, well, have you ever tried? Have you written a letter? I mean, I grew up in my generation. I had pen pals and we wrote. So we were more comfortable with the craft, again, of writing and of sharing a story. And so if you have a good story, not just a trip down memory lane, but something happened in your life that you either want to fictionalize or tell that's really different, then you can do it. It just takes a little work. Like, was it Edison that said it's 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration? So that's pretty much how it is with writing. But as a newspaper person, and I miss newspapers so much, it's a whole different world now, but there is something so tactile about writing. So like my husband did a little real estate for a while after he first retired, and he went out and he showed this house. I remember this couple, and he found them a house to rent. And he worked with them for 6 months. And then one Sunday they went into another real estate company and bought a house. And I'm like, well, what do you have to show for this? So I thought that has to be one of the more frustrating careers. And there's wonderful realtors out there. I'm glad he didn't stick with it. But, because at the end of every week, I had something I could hold in my hands. And so when you write a book, you can hold it. You can spin the pages. And I know a lot of people buy them online and buy the Kindle versions and the ebooks. But as the author, it's so nice to have that physical piece of satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that you can actually hold.
Just blows you away.
Yeah. You mostly had Conley's memories of his experiences. Did you do any research to kind of fill in any gaps?
Well, the big research was, of course, over the years, I would go with him on many trips and to his home in Hall's Crossroads and visit some of his classmates. And his mom passed away, I think, in 89. And we would walk around the old neighborhoods and he would show and tell me things. I was always fascinated by the stories, and I'd take notes and I'd look at the houses and kind of get a feel for it. And so then, of course, I had those tapes, and I still have probably 100. Some of them he went off on tangents, and we had probably be a whole other book about his time in North Africa and things like that. And so I had so my research was, having been there, I got a sense, and having been into the South and driven around and been to New Orleans and different places. And then, basically, being able to pull it together from those tape recordings were really the whole thing. So if you do have, if your listeners do have an older person, especially, because you want to get them on tape, because by the time you get around to doing something, they may no longer be here. And then you've got those memories and some of the stuff that makes it so nice, the little quips and the funny expressions and things like that really make something come alive.
Yes, definitely. I love that.
Time for our second break of this episode, and I really do love what she said about talking to the generations above us about their experiences, getting those stories on tape. I really wish that we had recordings of my grandparents, and we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of my dad's death, and I was just thinking as she was talking about that, do I have recordings of my dad's voice? I'm not sure that I do now that I think about it. Somewhere maybe, but there's so many things that I wish I could hear my dad say, or stories that I wish I could hear him tell, but it's still good to have those memories. So let's go ahead and take that break. When we come back, what Mary hopes readers will take away from this book. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Mary T. Ford about her book, Boy at the Crossroads. Let's go ahead and return to the interview.
What do you hope readers will take from the book?
Well, it's turned out interestingly, because initially I didn't even know it was coming of age. And then one of my instructors said, don't ignore that market. But what I have found is that the 70 and older set, especially men, love it. So if there was a way to market it, because they read and they just love it, like siphoning gas was something everybody did, apparently. It takes them back to a time where you could be a teenager and you probably weren't going to be arrested for doing, something pretty minor. So they love it. And then I've tried at the high schools and things, but what happens today, especially in the public schools, is I know in Massachusetts, I'm pretty sure in other states too, they have this curriculum. In Massachusetts, it's called, I think it's called MCAS. But so basically all the schools are teaching pretty much the same thing at the same time. So there's very little window for something that isn't part of that curriculum. And the kids are tested to have these MCAS tests. And if they don't do well, it reflects on the teacher. So it's been a little harder to break in. And so I'm a little disappointed in that, because I think young people will get a lot out of the book. But I find that a lot of them are very much into the fantasy world and like the Hunger Games and the Harry Potter type thing, rather than the Tom Sawyer tale, 100 years later. So, but I haven't given up, and I've done a lot of, talks at senior centers and library groups. And so I'm having fun with that. And people, especially the groups that have read it, love it, because a lot of people ask about Betty, who was the sister that Conley had that really kind of took him under her wing. And they wonder what happened to Betty. And of course, she died sadly many years ago. But so it's been fun. And so I would say it's more of a general audience. It could really appeal to anyone, but especially for people that maybe grew up in the 50s. Can really identify with that time. And it brings them some level of joy and humor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the amount of hitchhiking that happens in the book is it's amazing.
Yeah, hitchhiked a lot.
Yeah, and it was because you could.
Yeah, and then people carried, there weren't the roadside areas, so people had food and And it was a very much more trusting world. Though I know it was there were many, many problems. I mean, and he grew up, of course, in the Jim Crow South, but where he was from in East Tennessee, they were poor. Like, he had never seen a cotton field until he got to Georgia. So it was a little bit different, but it also just brings you back, to that time where it was trusting. You got into cars with strange people. Mm-hmm. And you didn't think that was going to be that you were going to be on Dateline the following week.
Right.
It was just a very different world. And it's nice to go back and reflect that. I mean, I always love the title of the book, Gone with the Wind, because I think it just kind of says that that's gone and that's an era that's over. And I feel a little bit about the 50s and that way, where that kind of way of life is just gone. But it's nice to sort of read about it and reflect upon what was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned Conley's sister, Betty, and she's in the book enough that you get glimpses of her, but not a lot. And I think in some ways she almost could have her own story, because, there's a comment that she didn't give her job up. She kept her job after she got married, and her husband is the one that's always cooking whenever.
Right. Yeah. Betty was no way she was going to give up her job at the phone company. She loved it. And she was a switchboard operator. So she used to joke and, she'd cross her fingers and say, I don't really listen. And you'd see her fingers crossed. So,
yeah.
People were more careful what they talked about. But she loved it, and she worked nights. So she'd be asleep in the daytime. And they had 2 sons. And Glenn was a big strapping guy. In fact, I think I have it in the book where they called him Bigfoot. I mean, his feet were huge. Mm-hmm. And he was, again, grew up on a very rough way. I mean, if somebody needed food, they either made it themselves or someone just got in the kitchen and cooked it up. And, that's what he did. So a wonderful man. Glenn was really he was one that Lee, whom I never met, was Conley's father, because he died back in 1962, 10 years before we met. But he was his favorite son-in-law, because I think they were kind of cut from the same mold.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned switchboards. I tried to explain to a high school intern of ours once about, well, first of all, he was flabbergasted that you had to pay for long distance, because he's always grown up with cell phones.
Yeah.
And so then we tried to explain to him what party lines were.
Oh my God. Yeah.
He was horrified. He was just horrified.
Well, it's funny, but I don't know if you've seen it. I've seen the little video where these 2 boys that look like they're in high school walk up to a rotary desk phone.
Yeah. And
one of these jokey ones, but we have an old, it's not an old phone, but it looks like an old phone, because
mm-hmm.
it was with the bell system, and so it looks like one of those old fashioned phones. And I've had it up, we've been here since 87. So we put it up in the kitchen, and no one uses it anymore, but it has a rotary dial. It just kind of sits there as a decoration on the wall. And my granddaughter, when I saw her over there trying to use it, it was like, she had been like thinking about this forever and said, I've got to try this. And trying to get her fingers to do the dialing. It was so interesting, because it wasn't a natural thing. Where back in the day, we were.
Well, I grew up with a rotary phone, and I hated it because I'd never got my fingers in the right spot, and I got yelled at once for the wrong number, and it scared me.
Well, back in the day, secretaries, remember they had like a special, like a little thing that's into the dial, and you just yank that thing around. So.
Oh, that's funny. This is your first published novel, but you mentioned that you're working on something else. Can you talk a little bit about that project?
Yes, I'm having a lot of fun, because, again, so when I finish this and you go through, and it doesn't matter really if you're self-published like I am, but through a company that assists you. And what they do a really good job with is the launch, which gets you, they understand the metadata and the algorithms on Amazon and the other platforms. So when someone is searching for your book, if they just search for coming of age novels, there's probably 3 million. They're never going to find you. So you learn how to do these keywords and things to sort of get more traction. And you have to remember too that there's no human involved. Things on Amazon, it's all artificial intelligence. So it isn't like someone is sitting up there saying, oh, we're going to put this book as number 1 or this book as number 2. It's all done on by some other intelligence that we have no control over. So some people, and I have a lot of friends that have done this, and you can do it. It costs you nothing. You just launch your book on Amazon all by yourself, but no one's going to find it. No one's going to read it. So you have to decide, what's your goal? And I definitely want the book to be read. I still do. And so I work on putting out press releases, and, I have my LinkedIn profile, and I have my website, and, I call libraries and schools and things like that. I'm having a lot of fun doing that because I was someone who worked for so many years and was so project oriented. So, but when I finished, and I thought, well, now what am I going to do? I have to think of another project, another writing project, because I've found I've really enjoyed meeting all these writers and authors. It's opened up a whole new world to me. And I can kind of not think about the career that I love so much and like it being over. So when we first moved to Massachusetts, and I'm actually from Massachusetts. So I had left after graduating from college and went to California, where I had gotten a teaching job. And that's where I met Conley. And then we got married. And through his job, we were transferred all over the place for many, many years. And then when we were in Illinois, he had the opportunity of being transferred to Massachusetts. And I said, oh my God, I'll be near home and my parents and everything. So when I first got back, I started as what's called a stringer, because I had been working as a reporter in Illinois. And I came back and I thought, well, I'll work my way up into the local newspaper. And so in my free time, I wrote a novel, and it's about a shipwreck that happened in Scituate in 1956 when we were living right near where it occurred. And the ship was basically stuck on the rocks. It was an Italian freighter for 9 months. And so I always thought I want to write a story about this, but I'm going to romanticize it and have it be a love story between one of the Italian sailors and an Irish widow on this little area of Scituate. So I wrote it, and then I gave it to a friend to look at, and he gave me some really good advice and says, it's a good start, but it's not ready for prime time. And then I got hired full time and then became an editor, and I put it up in the attic. So I went up and I found it, and it's so old that it actually had the perforations on the side, the old computer paper that came out like dots.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I found it and I started to rewrite it. And I'm having a ton of fun doing that and making it so much better. I mean, for one thing, after so many years in journalism, I'm a much better writer than I was when I started. And writing comes fairly easily to me. And then I've learned how to show more and not tell and describe. And so I've been doing my meetups with that. And I took a Grub Street course on novel in progress. And the young man that taught that course, I sent him the whole manuscript, and he has sent it back. And it's wonderful because he did each page I analyzed and then wrote like 10 pages and told me what I need to do. And so I'm in the middle of that. So I have to dive back in on the revisions, which I'm looking forward to, because editing and revising is what I like best. And then I'll figure out if I want to launch it the way I did before, or try a different company, or what my plans are. But that's kind of keeping me going. So I'm excited about that. And what I've learned is if you write the second book, more people will read your first book.
Yes. That makes sense.
Yeah. So, and one of the really funny things is, my name is Mary Ford, and that's my married name, and I've been happy with it all these years. It was a great byline because it doesn't get in the way of the story. It fits like on the same line. Like I've had several reporters over the years that have what I call a triple-barreled name, where they have it's huge name. It would have to go on 2 lines if we had a single column story. So, but if you Google Mary Ford, I think in Goodreads, it says read more books by Mary Ford, and there's like 180. And there's someone, I think she's from England, and she writes cookbooks.
Oh, fun.
Which is so fun, because anyone that knows me, the 2 things I'm not good at and don't do well is housekeeping and cooking. So the idea that someone wrote 180 cookbooks is just beyond. But a little funny aside, so when I first started in journalism, I walked into a newsroom, like I said, and I was 35 in Illinois, and I felt like I fit right in. And we were all hired to do freelance or stringers, which are paid by the assignment and the story, very low pay. But I was determined I wanted a career change, and so I went to a meeting, and it went into executive session, and they ended up buying a fire truck. And I came back in the middle of the night, and I wrote this story, and they edited it, and then it ran on the front page of the neighbor section because it was about one of the towns, and it was a daily paper. So I get the paper, and I'm all excited, and it said by Betty Ford, and I'm like, I said to the copy desk, what happened? And he said, we saw Ford, and he thought Betty. So it shows you what era.
Yeah.
So my first byline was Betty Ford.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. I remember my not first, but when I moved to a new town and started a job, and there was a newspaper article, and they completely got my last name wrong through the entire article. I was like, okay, I've gotten a new identity.
Oh, I know. Awful. You have to check the spelling. I mean, there's so many things that can go wrong. I know one story I wrote years ago, the guy's name was Gerard, and I had him as Gerald. And luckily his first name was only mentioned once, because then after that it was just his last name that we used.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt so bad, and then I just learned I still remember it. I always get the name right. Because, if I'm writing a story, because that is the worst. If someone says, well, you spelled my name wrong. And the names today, I mean, they can be, Mary Ford. In fact, people, especially in Massachusetts, where there are a lot of Italian names, and people would always say, they'd come up to the office and say, how do you spell that? And I go, like Ford. Like, right. And then they say, does it have an E? And I'm like, no. So then finally, I was at the Situate post office, and there was this wonderful English lady that worked there, behind the counter. And she had her tag on it. It said Mary Ford, and Ford had an E. And I went and gave her a big hug. And I said, I've been looking for the Mary Ford with an E.
And you finally found her.
And I found you.
And did you pronounce it Ford or 40?
No, Ford. It was just, it's a rare, but there are some Fords. I don't know whether they actually originally come from more of the Scandinavian, like, Ford the river or whatever. But anyway, so I did find her, and we had a laugh.
Oh, funny.
Isn't it crazy how much what difference one little letter can make? You just never know. At any rate, let's go ahead and take our last break of this episode. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets Podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets Podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Mary T. Ford.
You have talked a little bit about this already in terms of, if people want to write, then they should. But if you were having this conversation with someone, what then would you follow that up with? Yes, you should write. Here's maybe a good starting place.
Yes. Well, I would tell them, for one thing, write a letter to the editor, or write a letter to someone. Get your juices going. But the other thing is that I found, and I found this with reporters. So here's a good question I always asked when I was hiring a new reporter. One of my first questions was, are you a writer first or a reporter first? And almost all of them said writer first. And I would say that's the wrong answer, because And it didn't mean I didn't hire them, but it meant I had to teach them how to be a reporter, which was much harder than teaching them how to write. So writing, again, is a craft. And what I find is, if someone wants, and everybody has a story in them. I mean, the old expression my mother used to always say, when I write the great American novel, everyone has a novel inside them and they all think they're going to write it. I run into people all the time working on my novel, working on my memoir. So you have to sit down and get organized and try to do it, but take some classes. And the thing is, and they're available online and they're available in person and they're on Zoom groups and these meetups. But the biggest advice I can give, and I run into this all the time, and I struggle with it because when I was the editor, I was the boss. So I could change something. And I was always very respectful of one of my reporter's writing style. I never tried to change it into my style. I just really changed it if the structure was wrong or they used too many dialogue tags. I mean, there's nothing better than said. You don't say remarked. You don't say commented. You don't say shrugged. You just say said. Or if it's obvious, you don't even have to say said. Just leave it out. But so what I find is, especially in the author or writer world, is that people are way too possessive of their writing. So when you try to say, why don't you try this or that, they get very defensive and no, this is the way it should be. And the one, I think, fallback with self-publishing is, and this is where if you've got a thick skin like me, I want changes to be made. It doesn't bother me at all. I learned the hard way, listen to people that know how to do this, and then you're going to be successful at it. But I find that people, won't change it. And with the self-publishing, because you're the customer, eventually the self-publisher is just going to publish it. And it might be awful, but you didn't listen, and I find that really challenging. People will say, no, this is a memory I want to have, or this is, my aunt B was like this, and they just won't listen to how to develop the story. And that's the biggest failing. I mean, if you're open-minded, you want to do this, go and learn how to do it. Take any kind of little punches that you get about what's not working. Don't be embarrassed or possessive, and then just get down to it. And some people hire writing coaches, and I think sometimes that can be a good thing, where maybe that if they listen, that's the whole thing. And then if you've got, again, my biggest advice is if you've got a story, then go with the story, because people are going to want to read the story, whether it's that beautifully written or not. So I always had for news. So that was one of my, that's why I was successful in journalism. I could recognize the story, and, reporters would come back from meetings and say nothing happened. And I said, that's never the case. Mm-hmm. So let's see what happened and develop it into a story.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
How about reading? When you take time to read, just for you, who are your go-to authors and genres?
Well, I believe it or not, I really like nonfiction. I think that comes from my journalism type thing. I love Malcolm Gladwell. And I've been reading this book, and I don't have it right in front of me, but it's called Clue, C-L-U-E. And I think she's from Massachusetts. I heard her on the radio, and then I ordered the book. But it's fascinating because it talks about body language. And what made me really interested is because I'm doing a lot of these talks in front of groups, is that I wanted to make sure that I present myself in a welcoming way. And she goes into how you cross your arms, where you sit, like never sit at the end of the table, sit in the middle. Even how your eyebrows, not that I would remember to raise my eyebrows or whatever, but there's a lot of detail in there. And I just find it's fascinating to learn that. I've always been impressed with people when you go to a talk and they really captivate the room and they're really good at it. And I've been disappointed over the years when someone isn't. And I don't, there's a school, a local school, a private Catholic girls' school, and not too far from where I live. And we would cover their graduation every year. And some of their graduation speakers, they were always an alumna, were wonderful. And others were just not good at all. They were sitting there just what? Oh, this is terrible. And I'll never forget there was one, and this is a huge mistake. Never start your speech by saying, I'm not a good speaker or I'm really nervous, because now the audience is just looking for the fact that you're not going to be good and that you're going to be shaking or something. They're going to pay attention to what you have to say. And I remember this one gal stood up and said that her graduation speaker was so boring. It was just terrible. And then she went on, and we were all looking at each other going, oh my God, she's boring.
Yeah. Self-fulfilling right there.
Yeah. So I like a personal growth aspect. And it's interesting. So I have a granddaughter, and she's 20, and she's at a community college in Southern Alabama where she lives. And so she's going to be reading for her American literature class, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. And I told her, well, I'll get a copy too. And then we can read it together, and I can help her with some of the analysis. So I'm starting to read The Scarlet Letter, which I haven't read since high school.
All right.
So that'll be fun. And it's an interesting book because it really is about a powerful woman.
Yeah. Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see how you react to it now as opposed to how you reacted to it the first time through. You have the same thoughts. So
that's one part. But I should read more. But I'm definitely more of a news reader and a nonfiction reader, believe it or not, than sitting down with a huge novel.
Yeah, reading is reading, whatever you like.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about internet presence? Do you have a website and any social media that you're active on where people can find you?
Yes, my website is maryfordedit.com, and there's a lot about the book there, and there's some pictures and kind of a wrap up different awards and things like that. And then I'm on Facebook, just as my personal Facebook, but I use it as well. They can find me. I think I'm Mary T, as in Tom Ford, on Facebook, and I'm on LinkedIn. Again, I think I'm Mary T Ford, and they'll recognize, that would be a picture of me. I have short blonde hair and glasses. And I think that's it. I'm not on Instagram or Twitter. I haven't ruled those out, but at the moment I haven't made the effort to join those. So.
Okay. All right. Well, Mary, we've talked about a few different things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to make sure you highlight during our time together?
Just look at your questions quickly. Yep, we've got that. My favorite authors, it's fine. Yep, I just would encourage people. It's a lot of fun to write and to join. I mean, I'm in one wonderful writing group that sprung from another group, the woman that before COVID, and then it kind of fell apart. And then she brought it back together. And this group is great. There's about 8 or 10 of us that's on. And they have just put a writing prompt every week or two. And so what we do while we, for the next session, it's actually twice a month, we write less, 500 words or less on the prompt. And so it's nothing that my personal ones that I would ever use to be published or whatever. But some are really good. I've told some of the women they should be columnists because it's really good. And one woman just does poetry, but it's just a fun exercise and to see what other people are doing and get a little bit of feedback. So you can start with something like that. It's very supportive, and then graduate up to something a little more complex. But I find when I'm part of a writing community, whether it's the meetups or in person, is that you really need to commit yourself and to participate. And part of that participation, which I find very challenging, is critiquing other people's writing. And again, because it's not like just editing it and saying this isn't, I have to make these changes for the newspaper. This is critiquing something in many more levels, like, about their storyline, if it's understandable and, where it's going and things like that. So it's a challenging thing, but if people want to write their story or a story, they should do it. I did it. If I can do it, anyone can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And thank you also for taking time to talk to me about the book and writing and everything we talked about. I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate being your guest. I appreciate it so much. I really do. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much to Mary for taking the time to talk to me about this book and her husband's experiences and just so many other things. I really enjoyed our conversation, and we spoke a little bit before and after we started recording, and that was fun as well. Just a very enjoyable conversation, and I really enjoyed the story, and would like to hear more about some of the adventures her husband had, because I can't imagine that he just stopped having adventures after being a teenager. So he did go into the military, and just a little bit at the end of this book that talks about that experience, I'm sure he had some experiences in that time of his life as well. Thank you to Mary. And if you are, of course, maybe you've got a parent of this generation, maybe you are of this generation, grandparent, it's just fun to read about someone's experiences during a very different time. It's not that far past, 80 years, give or take, for the 40s, 70 years, because I guess this book took place in 55, so 70 years ago, but how very different the world was just in terms of technology and people's experiences. So if that's something that is of interest to you, definitely check out this book. I hope you will join me also for my next episode when Catherine Raphael will be joining me. We'll be turning our attention to a fantasy book. That one is called Journey to the Heartstone. So join me for Catherine's interview on the next episode. And as always, if you are a fan of this podcast, like, subscribe, follow on whatever platform you listen on, and leave a review, whether written or starred. I actually want to thank the person who just left me a lovely review in the last couple of weeks, I think. I just noticed it the other day on Apple Podcasts, and it was very kind. And so I do see them, I do read them, I do appreciate them. Thank you when you take the time to leave those reviews. It not only makes me smile, but it also gets this podcast out to more listeners. So thank you for that. And just thank you for being you and being readers who like to find new authors and experience new books. I hope you're having a great weekend now. Hope you have something fun planned for your weekend, and I hope that weekend affords you plenty of time to do a lot of reading and get yourself lost in a book or two. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.